Imagine a border not just as a line on a map, but as a living, breathing entity. A membrane through which the desires of one nation and the desperation of another constantly filtered. In the arid, sun-baked landscapes of northern Mexico, in the state of Tamaulipas, this was the world into which Juan García Ábrego was born on September 13, 1944. His story does not begin with the crack of a gun or a brick of cocaine, but in the seemingly mundane world of cattle ranching. The García Ábrego family was not poor. They were, in fact, deeply embedded in the rustic economy of the region, owning land and livestock. But this legitimate frontier life was intricately woven with another, darker trade, smuggling. For generations, the unofficial economy of the Mexico-U.S. border had been contraband. It was a family business, a tradition almost, and Juan's uncles were seasoned players in moving goods across the Rio Grande, evading the gaze of authorities on both sides. This was his kindergarten, his formative education. He wasn't learning letters and numbers in the same way other children were. He was learning the value of a discreet contact, the layout of a hidden trail, the price of silence, and the art of greasing palms. He saw firsthand that the border was not a barrier, but a gateway, and that the most successful men were not those who worked the land, but those who controlled the invisible routes across it. Young Juan was a quiet, observant boy, more inclined to watch and listen than to speak. He absorbed the lessons of his uncle's operations, understanding that smuggling was a logistics business, a matter of supply chains and risk management long before those terms were used in corporate boardrooms. The cattle were a cover, a symbol of respectability, but the real money, the real power, flowed not from the slow growth of livestock, but from the fast, clandestine movement of anything the Americans wanted and the Mexicans could provide. This dual life, the public face of the rancher and the private reality of the smuggler, shaped his worldview entirely. He saw no contradiction between the two. They were simply two sides of the same capitalist coin. The end of the Bracero program in 1964, which had allowed Mexican agricultural workers to legally work in the United States, created a vacuum. Suddenly, there was a massive population of men familiar with crossing the border, who now found the legal routes closed. The smuggling networks, once used for goods and a few people, were now primed for a much more lucrative and dangerous cargo. The stage was being set, the pieces were moving, and Juan García Ábrego, now a young man, was patiently waiting in the wings. Having completed his apprenticeship, not in a university, but in the dust and shadows of the borderlands, ready to apply his family's age-old trade to a new, explosive commodity that was about to sweep across America. Cocaine, the 1970s dawned, and with it, a cultural shift in the United States that would prove to be the catalyst for Juan García Ábrego's meteoric rise. While the hippie movement championed peace and love, its undercurrents and the burgeoning disco scene created an unprecedented demand for a specific kind of escape cocaine. It was the drug of the elite, the glamorous, and the ambitious, and its high price tag promised astronomical profits for anyone who could reliably deliver it from the source in South America to the bustling markets of Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. The existing criminal outfits, including Garcia Ábrego's own family operations, were proficient in moving marijuana and a modest amount of heroin. But cocaine was a different beast altogether. It required a new level of sophistication, a more complex international network, and a cold-blooded willingness to engage in a level of violence that was previously unimaginable. Juan, now in his late 20s, observed this burgeoning demand with the keen eye of a seasoned businessman, spotting a market gap. He understood that the future was white, powdery, and immensely profitable. His first masterstroke was to recognize that his greatest asset was not a stash of weapons or a team of enforcers, but his geographical position. The Gulf of Mexico, with its vast, unpatrolled waters and countless secluded inlets, was a smuggler's paradise. The port cities of Tampico and Veracruz became his strategic hubs, the back doors through which the future would arrive. He began to forge alliances, not as a subordinate, but as a partner. He reached out to the established Colombian cartels, particularly the Medellin cartel led by the infamous Pablo Escobar. To the Colombians, García Ábrego was the perfect solution, a reliable, well-connected Mexican with a proven smuggling apparatus who could solve their most pressing problem: getting their product across the formidable U.S. border. He proposed a business model that was revolutionary in its simplicity and efficiency. The Mexican cartel would be paid in kind, not just in cash. For every kilogram of cocaine the Gulf Cartel successfully smuggled into the United States, they would keep a portion as their fee. This tax for his services allowed García Ábrego to amass his own incredible inventory, which he could then sell through his own burgeoning distribution networks, effectively making him a dominant wholesaler in his own right. He was no longer just a transporter. He was a partner, a stakeholder in the entire continental narcotics enterprise. This was the true birth of the Gulf Cartel as a major power. García Ábrego industrialized the smuggling process. He moved beyond small planes and individual mules, investing in a fleet of private jets, sophisticated fishing vessels, and tractor-trailers with expertly engineered hidden compartments. He corrupted officials at every level of the Mexican government, from local police and border patrol agents to high-ranking federales and politicians, weaving a web of protection so deep that he became virtually untouchable within Mexico. His organization operated with the precision of a multinational corporation, with distinct departments for logistics, finance, security, and bribery. He was a quiet, unassuming CEO of a criminal empire. His power derived not from flamboyant displays of wealth, but from the silent, ruthless efficiency of his operations. By the end of the decade, the Gulf Cartel was the undisputed gatekeeper for the majority of Colombian cocaine entering the United States, and Juan García Ábrego, the rancher's son from the border, had become a multimillionaire kingpin. His name whispered with a mixture of fear and respect in the corridors of power on both sides of the Rio Grande. His empire built not on the old world traditions of his uncles, but on the cold, hard logic of a new globalized drug trade. As the 1980s unfolded, The empire of Juan García Ábrego did not just grow, it evolved into a state within a state, a parallel sovereignty whose influence permeated every facet of life in its territories. The sheer volume of cash flowing through the Gulf Cartel became unimaginable, a torrent of hundreds of millions, then billions of US dollars that needed to be laundered, stored, and legitimized. García Ábrego, ever the astute businessman, understood that money was both his greatest weapon and his most significant vulnerability. He established a sophisticated financial arm to his organization, employing accountants and bankers who orchestrated a complex web of transactions through shell companies, offshore accounts, and investments in legitimate businesses across Mexico and the United States. Vast ranches, construction firms, real estate holdings, and even shares in industrial companies were quietly purchased, weaving the cartel's illicit wealth into the very fabric of the legal economy. This process of money laundering was as critical to his survival as any smuggling route, for it allowed his organization to function not as a criminal gang, but as a de facto corporate conglomerate with a diversified portfolio, its true source of power obscured behind a veneer of respectability. Yet, this immense financial success brought with it an equally immense problem: the attention of the United States government. For years, U.S. drug enforcement agencies had been aware of the flow of narcotics across the border, but they had primarily focused on the Colombian suppliers. It was García Ábrego's revolutionary business model and its staggering success that finally made him a person of supreme interest. American agents began to piece together the puzzle of this shadowy figure, who was not a flamboyant drug lord like his Colombian counterparts, but a quiet, systematic administrator of a smuggling empire. The Drug Enforcement Administration and the FBI started Operation Cactus, a dedicated task force aimed solely at dismantling the Gulf Cartel and capturing its leader. This marked a pivotal shift in the war on drugs. For the first time, the U.S. government was targeting the Mexican transportation network with the same intensity as the South American producers. They began tracking his planes, monitoring his associates, and painstakingly following the money trail. Meanwhile, within Mexico, García Ábrego's power was becoming absolute. He commanded a private army of corrupt police officers and dedicated enforcers known as pistoleros. He lived a life of insulated luxury, yet he was paranoid, constantly moving between a network of safe houses. His security detailed a small army equipped with weapons that often outgunned those of the Mexican military. He was a ghost, a name on paperwork, and a voice on secure phone lines. His physical presence a myth to all but his most trusted lieutenants. He wielded the power of life and death over judges, journalists, and politicians, and his corruption reached so high that it was widely believed he had direct lines to officials within Mexico's ruling political party, the PRI, ensuring a level of federal protection that made him seem invincible. This period represented the zenith of his power, a time when the Gulf Cartel was the most powerful criminal organization in Mexico, and Juan García Ábrego was its undisputed, untouchable king, a man who had successfully built a corporate empire whose only product was illegal, whose supply chain was built on violence, and whose customer base was an entire nation's addiction. The year 1985, however, would introduce a seismic shift in the global drug trade, an event that would inadvertently catapult Juan García Ábrego from being a powerful kingpin to becoming the indispensable linchpin of the entire Western Hemisphere's cocaine industry. This event was the relentless pressure from the United States government on the Medellin cartel, which culminated in the brutal murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, the subsequent political firestorm, and the all-out assault on the Colombian cartels, known as the kingpin strategy, forced Pablo Escobar and his counterparts to radically rethink their logistics. The traditional Caribbean routes through the Bahamas and Florida became hot, heavily monitored by U.S. Coast Guard cutters and surveillance aircraft. The Colombians needed a new, safer, and more reliable super highway for their product. And there was only one man who could provide it, Juan García Ábrego, almost overnight. The Gulf Cartel was transformed from a major player into the single most critical component of the global cocaine supply chain. García Ábrego was ready. He had spent years building an infrastructure for this moment. His network of routes through the vast, unpoliceable expanse of the U.S.-Mexico border, stretching from the Gulf Coast of Texas to the deserts of Arizona, became the primary conduit. He perfected the use of polis, or human mules, who would carry backpacks of drugs across remote desert crossings. He expanded his fleet of nodrizas, or mothership fishing vessels, that would meet Colombian Go, fast boats in international waters, and transfer multi-ton loads of cocaine, which would then be brought ashore to hidden coves along the Mexican coastline. He also industrialized the use of commercial cargo, buying off shipping clerks and customs officials to move massive quantities of drugs concealed within legitimate goods in tractor, trailers, and railway cars. The volume of cocaine flowing through his hands became staggering, estimated to be in the tens of tons every single month. This unprecedented volume generated profits so vast they became almost abstract. A logistical nightmare of cash that had to be physically transported back to Mexico in armored vehicles and private aircraft. With this immense new power, however, came a necessary evolution in the cartel's tactics. The level of violence, once used strategically, began to escalate. Rivalry with emerging cartels, particularly the rising Sinaloa cartel, intensified over control of these precious smuggling routes, known as plazas. Betrayals within his own organization were met not just with execution, but with terrifying, public displays of brutality designed to send a message. The bodies of rivals and traitors began to appear, bearing the gruesome signatures of cartel violence, torture, dismemberment, a stark departure from Garcia, from Brego's earlier, more businesslike approach. He was no longer just a smuggler. He was a warlord protecting the most valuable criminal enterprise on earth. His name, once known only to law enforcement and those in the underworld, began to creep into the consciousness of the American public. He was becoming a legend, a phantom whose influence was felt in every line of cocaine snorted in American nightclubs. A criminal mastermind who had made himself the sole toll booth operator on the busiest drug highway in the world. This period was the absolute peak of his influence, a time when he held the keys to the kingdom. But it was also the moment he cast the longest shadow, a shadow that would eventually make him impossible for the world's sole superpower to ignore. The transition from the 1980s into the 1990s marked the zenith of Juan García Ábrego's empire, a period where his influence was so pervasive it seemed to bend the very fabric of reality within his domains. The river of cocaine flowing north, and the corresponding torrent of dollars flowing south, created an economy of its own, one that propped up entire towns and corrupted institutions to their core. In cities like Matamoros, Nuevo Laredo, and Reynosa, the Gulf Cartel was not a criminal organization. It was the primary employer, the unofficial government, and the ultimate arbiter of justice. García Ábrego's wealth was now estimated to be in the billions. A figure so abstract it placed him in the same financial league as some of the world's most powerful legitimate industrialists. He owned fleets of private aircraft, including a custom-equipped Boeing 727 jetliner used solely for moving multi-ton shipments of cocaine, a symbol of the sheer industrial scale of his operation. His personal life was a study in insulated opulence, a stark contrast to the brutal realities of his trade. He resided in palatial, heavily fortified estates, complete with panic rooms, underground tunnels, and state-of-the-art surveillance systems. He developed a taste for fine cognac, tailored suits from London, and luxury watches, yet he remained an intensely private and paranoid figure, his public appearances rarer than those of a reclusive movie star. His power to corrupt was now absolute. It was widely reported that he possessed a Padrino de Oro, a golden Rolodex, containing the private contact information and bank account details of mayors, state governors, police commanders, and high-ranking officials within Mexico's ruling Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI. This wasn't mere bribery. It was a systemic takeover. He didn't just pay off individuals. He integrated his organization into the power structure of the nation itself. Law enforcement agencies that were not on his payroll were often deliberately missiled or hamstrung by those who were. Arrest warrants would mysteriously vanish from court files. Investigations would be abruptly closed. Key witnesses would recant their testimonies or simply disappear. This created an aura of invincibility around him, a belief among his subordinates and the populace that Don Juan was truly above the law, a force of nature as immutable as the harsh northern Mexican sun. It was during this peak of his power, in 1993, that the United States government made an unprecedented decision, one that would forever seal his place in criminal history. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, recognizing that his influence was a direct and grave threat to American national security and public health, placed Juan García Ábrego on its 10 most wanted fugitives list. He was the first drug trafficker to ever receive this distinction, a dubious honor that placed him in the company of terrorists, serial killers, and the most dangerous domestic criminals in America. The announcement sent a shockwave through law enforcement and the criminal underworld alike. It was a declaration of total war, a signal that the immense resources of the world's most powerful law enforcement agency were now laser focused on one man. A $5 million reward was offered for information leading to his capture, turning every associate, every rival, and every citizen into a potential informant. For García Ábrego, this was both the ultimate accolade of his criminal success and the beginning of its end. He was no longer a regional problem. He was America's public enemy number one. The placement on the FBI's 10 most wanted list was a seismic event that shattered the carefully constructed walls of Juan García Ábrego's fortress of power. Overnight, the shadow he had so masterfully operated within was flooded with the blinding, relentless spotlight of international scrutiny. The $5 million bounty on his head was not merely a number. It was a weapon of mass betrayal, transforming his world into a landscape of potential treachery. Where once his wealth had bought loyalty, now the immense reward and the relentless pressure from the United States government sowed seeds of deep paranoia and self-preservation among his inner circle. The FBI and now even the CIA poured resources into what had become one of the highest priority manhunts in the world. They employed every tool at their disposal, signals intelligence, to track his satellite phones, financial forensics to follow the labyrinthine money trails, and a network of informants cultivated from the ranks of his disillusioned underlings and captured rivals. The pressure was not just from the north. In Mexico, the political winds were beginning to shift. The long-ruling PRI, which had often turned a blind eye or actively collaborated with the cartels in a tacit agreement of managed corruption, was facing growing internal and external pressure to demonstrate its commitment to the rule of law. The United States was applying intense diplomatic pressure, threatening to label Mexico as a non-cooperative nation in the drug war, a move that would have had devastating economic consequences. The new administration of President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, seeking to legitimize its standing on the world stage, could no longer afford the blatant impunity of García Ábrego. His capture became a political necessity, a trophy to be presented to the American government to prove Mexico's sovereignty and its commitment to the bilateral fight against narcotics. This created a pincer movement, with American intelligence and Mexican political will closing in on him from both sides. His life devolved into a claustrophobic nightmare of constant movement. He could no longer trust the very corruption that had protected him for so long, as the price for shielding him had become too high for many of his political patrons. His safe houses felt less safe. Every convoy movement was a potential ambush. Every communication was a risk of interception. The sophisticated corporate executive of crime was being forced back into the life of a furtive fugitive, his billion-dollar empire useless in the face of a simple, pressing need to remain unseen. The man who had commanded private armies and corrupted nations was now reduced to trusting a shrinking circle of bodyguards, his freedom hanging by a thread that was being systematically frayed by the combined determined efforts of two nations. The legend of his invincibility was cracking, and through those cracks poured the cold, hard light of a reality he had long evaded. No empire, no matter how powerful or wealthy, can ultimately stand against the focused will of determined states. The hunter had become the hunted, and the vast territory he once ruled was now a cage, its borders shrinking with every passing day. The noose tightened with an inexorable, mechanical precision throughout 1995, a year that must have felt like an endless, waking nightmare for Juan García Ábrego. The collaborative machinery of U.S. and Mexican law enforcement, once stymied by corruption and a lack of political will, now operated with a singular, devastating focus. The key to his capture was not a dramatic shootout or a clever trap, but the patient, painstaking work of intelligence gathering and the exploitation of human weakness. Informants, motivated by the massive bounty, fear of extradition, or simple self-preservation as they saw the empire crumbling, began to provide a steady stream of actionable intelligence. The Americans, through their sophisticated electronic surveillance, were piecing together his communication patterns and his movements between a rotating series of safe houses. They knew he was relying on his most trusted bodyguards and a few loyal family members, but even that inner circle was under immense strain. The Mexican government, under direct orders from the highest levels, had assembled a special tactical unit, its members vetted for loyalty, to act on this intelligence. The break came in early 1996. Through a combination of wiretaps and human sources, authorities pinpointed a key logistical coordinator for García Ábrego. This man, under the threat of immediate imprisonment and the lure of a new life, provided the crucial detail they needed: the location of a primary safe house on the outskirts of Monterrey, a modern, fortified villa that blended into an affluent neighborhood, its normal exterior belying the panic rooms and security systems within. On the morning of January 14, 1996, the order was given. The specially vetted Mexican police unit, likely with DEA advisors monitoring from a discreet distance, moved in. There was no prolonged siege, no massive firefight that would later become a hallmark of cartel arrests. The operation was swift, clinical, and anticlimactic, designed to overwhelm and secure before any alarm could be raised or any corrupt official could tip off the target. They breached the compound, subdued his security detail without a single shot being fired, and found Juan García Ábrego himself, the legendary ghost, the billionaire kingpin, in a state of undress, utterly unprepared for his own demise. He was caught not with a gun in his hand, but in a moment of profound vulnerability, a stark and humiliating contrast to the image of the all-powerful, untouchable godfather he had so carefully cultivated. There was no grand last stand, only the quiet, definitive click of handcuffs. The man who had controlled the flow of cocaine to an entire nation, who had corrupted governments and evaded capture for over a decade, was taken into custody without resistance. The news spread like a shockwave. In the United States, it was heralded as a major victory in the war on drugs. In Mexico, it was a moment of profound symbolism, a demonstration that even the most powerful criminal could be brought to ground. And in the underworld, it created a power vacuum of catastrophic proportions, a void that would soon be filled by a new generation of even more ruthless and violent successors. For Juan García Ábrego, the architect of his own empire, the journey was over. The long fall from the pinnacle of power had ended on a cold, hard floor in a Monterey safe house. The capture of Juan García Ábrego was not the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a new, complex legal and diplomatic chapter that would see him transformed from a sovereign, like kingpin, into a geopolitical pawn. His initial hours and days in Mexican custody were a masterclass in preemptive damage control by the Mexican government. Fearing that his immense wealth and deep-rooted corruption network could still spring him from a Mexican prison, or that a rival cartel might attempt to assassinate him to silence him, the authorities moved him with extreme secrecy. He was not paraded before the media. Instead, he was rendered a ghost once more, this time within the state's prison system. The Salinas administration, having secured its trophy, now faced an immense dilemma. Holding him in Mexico was a colossal security risk and a perpetual temptation for his still powerful organization. The United States, for its part, immediately initiated extradition proceedings, demanding that the man who had flooded their cities with poison for over a decade face justice in an American courtroom. This created a delicate situation fraught with national pride. Mexico's constitution, at the time, had a strong tradition of refusing to extradite its citizens to face foreign justice, viewing it as a matter of national sovereignty. Yet, the political and diplomatic pressure from Washington was immense. Behind closed doors, a high-stakes negotiation was underway. The Mexican government, wanting to demonstrate its capability and sovereignty, first insisted on prosecuting him domestically. However, the Americans argued, persuasively, that their evidence was far more comprehensive, their witness protection program more robust, and their ability to secure a conviction and a sentence that would truly ensure he never walked free was absolute. Meanwhile, García Ábrego, now stripped of his power and isolated in a cell, would have been contemplating his own bleak future. His only leverage was the information he possessed. The names of the politicians, police commanders, and business figures he had corrupted. This knowledge was both a potential shield and a death sentence. To reveal, it could earn him some leniency, but would certainly mark him for death by his former associates. To remain silent was to accept a long imprisonment, in a move that signaled a significant shift in Mexico's approach to its most powerful criminals. The Mexican government, under the new administration of President Ernesto Zedillo, made a historic decision. They would allow the extradition. It was a calculated move. By handing him over, they offloaded a monumental security burden and gained significant diplomatic capital with the United States, while simultaneously neutralizing a man who knew too many of their own dirty secrets. On a day shrouded in secrecy, Juan García Ábrego was taken from his Mexican prison cell, placed on a U.S. government plane, and flown to the United States. As the plane ascended, it marked the final, irrevocable end of his empire. He was no longer Don Juan, the untouchable lord of the border. He was now prisoner number one, a commodity to be traded, a symbol of a new, fragile cooperation in a war that was about to enter its bloodiest phase yet, all while he sat in chains, staring out at the clouds, a king dethroned and exiled from his kingdom forever. The American judicial system, a machine built on procedure and evidence, now enveloped Juan García Ábrego, processing him with a dispassionate efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the violent and chaotic world he had ruled. He was arraigned in a federal court in Houston, Texas, the very state whose cities he had supplied with narcotics for years. The charges against him were a sprawling litany of federal crimes that read like a history of the modern drug trade: continuing criminal enterprise, racketeering, money laundering, and a host of narcotics trafficking violations. The U.S. government, having pursued him for so long, had built an overwhelming case. They presented a mountain of evidence gathered over more than a decade: wiretap transcripts of his satellite phone conversations detailing multi-ton shipments, financial records tracing the labyrinthine flow of billions of dollars, and the testimonies of a procession of former associates, pilots, money launderers, and enforcers who had decided to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. These witnesses painted a detailed picture of a cold, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient CEO of crime, a man who viewed violence as a necessary business tool and corruption as standard operating procedure. The defense, faced with this insurmountable wall of evidence, had little room to maneuver. There was no dramatic trial where Garcia Ábrego took the stand to defend his empire, recognizing the futility of a fight, and likely as part of a broader negotiation to avoid a potential life sentence without the possibility of parole. He entered a plea of guilty. In 1998, he stood before a federal judge for sentencing. The proceeding was the final, formal act of his demolition. The judge, embodying the full weight of the American legal system, sentenced Juan García Ábrego to 11 life sentences, plus an additional 55 years in federal prison, and ordered him to pay millions in fines. The number was so large as to be almost symbolic, a mathematical expression of permanent removal from society. The man who had commanded a fleet of jets and a private army was now a number in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, designated as inmate for 986-79. He was initially sent to the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, a legendary maximum security prison reserved for the most dangerous inmates. His life was now dictated by the unyielding rhythm of institutional routine headcounts, controlled movements, meals in a cafeteria, and hours spent in a small, sterile cell. The vast, open landscapes of his northern Mexican ranches were replaced by a concrete exercise yard. The whispered commands that moved mountains of cocaine were replaced by the shouted orders of prison guards. The power to shape destinies was reduced to the struggle for small comforts within the prison's rigid hierarchy. He became a ghost once more, but this time he was a ghost confined to a single, heavily monitored location. His name slowly fading from the headlines as new, more violently flamboyant cartel leaders rose to fill the power vacuum his downfall had created. His incarceration was touted as one of the greatest victories in the war on drugs, a definitive proof that the system could, eventually, catch up with even the most powerful and elusive of kingpins. Yet, his removal did not stem the tide of narcotics. It merely reshaped the battlefield, fragmenting his empire and unleashing a new era of even more brutal cartel warfare for control of the plazas he had once dominated so completely. The story of Juan García Ábrego does not end with the clang of a prison cell door. Rather, it dissolves into a long, quiet twilight, a decades-long postscript of incarceration and obscurity that stands as a profound and complex epilogue to a life of staggering ambition and power. Transferred from Leavenworth to the ADX Florence supermax prison in Colorado, the most secure penitentiary in the United States, he was placed into a form of existence designed to erase a man not physically, but psychologically. ADX Florence, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, is where the federal system houses its most high-risk and infamous inmates, those deemed too dangerous or to escape, prone for any other facility. Here, García Ábrego entered a world of perpetual lockdown, spending 23 hours a day in a soundproofed concrete cell, with meals delivered through a slot in a solid steel door. His view of the world was reduced to a sliver of Colorado sky through a window designed to prevent any sense of orientation. The man who had once navigated the complexities of international logistics and high-level corruption now navigated the stark geometry of a 7F 12-foot space. The relentless, silent efficiency of his corporate style cartel was now mirrored by the relentless, silent efficiency of the American carceral state, a system whose sole purpose was his permanent and utter neutralization. In this environment, the legendary kingpin, the first drug lord on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, slowly faded into a ghost of his own legend. Over the years, sporadic and unconfirmed reports would surface, rumors of failing health, of the psychological toll of extreme isolation, of him being a broken old man, but concrete information became a rarity. His name, once whispered with fear, was largely forgotten by a new generation captivated by the more visibly brutal cartel wars of the Zetas, the Sinaloa cartel, and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Organizations that rose from the power vacuum his capture created and who perfected the public, theatrical violence he had generally avoided. His legacy is thus a deeply contradictory one. On one hand, his capture and permanent imprisonment represent a clear, unequivocal victory for international law enforcement, a testament to what can be achieved with relentless pursuit and political cooperation. It proved that no criminal, no matter how wealthy or well-connected, is truly beyond reach. Yet, on a broader, more sobering level, his story is a powerful cautionary tale about the limits of such victories. The dismantling of his Gulf Cartel did not end the drug trade, it deregulated it. It shattered a centralized, business-like monopoly into a bloody, chaotic free for all among numerous splinter groups, leading to an exponential increase in violence and social carnage within Mexico that continues to this day. The business model he perfected, the Mexican cartel, as the indispensable logistics partner for South American producers, not only survived him, but became the entrenched standard model for the entire Western Hemisphere's narcotics industry. The billions of dollars in profits continued to flow, corrupting institutions and fueling violence, merely under new, more fragmented management. Juan García Ábrego, now an old man in his 80s, remains alive as a legal entity, a prisoner in the strictest sense. His life a monument to the fact that while individuals can be held accountable, the systems they create, the economic incentives, the corrupting influence of vast wealth, the insatiable demand for illicit substances, often prove far more resilient and enduring than the men who initially built them. His life serves as the ultimate reminder that the war on drugs is not a battle against individual kingpins, but a struggle against a hydra cutting off one head. Even the most powerful one only leads to the growth of several more in its place.